Well, hello, everyone. This is Lou Zacharilla, a founder of the Intelligent Community Forum. It has been 34 days since the World Health Organization declared the outbreak of COVID-19 a global pandemic. The number of cases worldwide now exceeds 1.9 million cases, and the good news is that almost 454,000 people have recovered from the disease globally. On Good Friday, the total number of novel coronaviruses and deaths here in New York totaled 7,067. That's statewide. By Easter Sunday morning, the number was over 9,000 deaths. And today, we expect that we will read that it will be closer to 11,000 total deaths. All of those numbers, by the way, are greater than the entire population of the town and village which I grew up in upstate New York. It reflects the plight of many rural communities and the fear that is now rolling through them. Last night and tonight in major news accounts, there were concerns voiced that the national food supply might be interrupted. And so we're going to be looking at that more closely. With regard to the New York economy returning to livelihood, 7 governors led by the governor of my state, New York State, formed a Northeast Regional Alliance, and those 7 governors now will be working as a task force to try to understand what the proper staging is so that the 7 states, which represent a significant amount of economic development, can come back in a coordinated fashion. And that's the first of its type. We expect that there will be one on the west coast of the United States as well. But what is happening globally in rural areas? Well, today we thought we would take a look at the potential responses in rural China and maybe take a snapshot of rural Italy in this crisis. And we've got someone who's uniquely positioned to talk about both of those things. So I invited Professor Giulio Verdini back to the ICF to discuss this. He's an urbanist in economics. He's a reader at the University of Westminster in London. He does an awful lot of other things. He's written and lectured. He lived in China for 6 years. He helped author a UNESCO report on culture in rural China and how rural China can be stabilized using elements of culture. So he is eminently qualified to speak to this subject. So you've heard him on our podcasts, but now you get a chance to see what he looks like and how good looking he is, by the way. So we've got him with us today, and we're very, very thankful to have him. Giulio, welcome to No Place But Home.
Thank you very much, Lou, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be again here with you.
Very good. And where are you physically today?
I am based in Paris at the moment, where I am working from home, as many of the people around. And yeah, I'm keeping my work online.
Yeah, of course. And I'm not going to ask you if you read all of those books behind you. That's the old interviewer's questions, but you probably wrote half of them. Can you give us a sense? And I'm gonna start right in. Given you were in Paris, I believe, or China, I should say, for 6 years doing work. Of course, the UNESCO report is kind of a landmark report about rural China, exploring the cultural aspects of it. But can you give us a sense of what you believe is happening in rural China at the moment as the coronavirus, continues to go through China and the world?
Yeah, sure. I think that we need overall to locate China and in a global context, and particularly in relationship to the coronavirus first. It seems that the problem of the virus is, of course, pretty much an urban problem at the moment, everywhere actually in the world. So no matter if it's in China or in New York or in London, Paris, and so on. And if I see the numbers in China, this is exactly the same situation. So it started, of course, earlier than in other parts of the world. in late January. It started in Hubei province, which is the same size of a state, of a country in Europe. It affected mostly the city of Wuhan, which is the capital city, and then it spread all over China. But again, by looking at the numbers, it seems that it affected really the main cities first, main mega cities of China. Of course, I got the sense at some point that there was also spreading in some villages, in some rural areas of China. So the rural China was not immune by that. But on the other hand, again, if you look at the geography of that, it seems that it was mostly near main cities. I mean, the structure of cities in China is like, in some areas particularly, is dense, rural, urban continuum, if you like. So therefore, it's very difficult to say what is the real impact on rural China. It's mainly urban and the surrounding areas. That's what I would say in general.
So it's not so distinct in that, you know, as I mentioned, my hometown in upstate New York is a very, very distinct rural area, far from any major cities. In China, it is not so much. So based on what you know, how do you think rural China is responding to the virus? Because the threat is obviously going to be coming from a very, very near, densely populated city in most cases.
Now, again, as in other parts of the world, I think that the countryside is showing more resiliency, if you like. I mean, at least according to what I've heard. And by the way, I am working with on a research project in Sichuan at the moment. And just to make an example, they have just restarted really working and operating their own business as before. So actually, they are recovering quite quickly. And this is a sort of intermediate cities, and with of course many rural areas around that. And so it seems to me that actually the rural economy actually could support the virus in a certain way. Clearly, in terms of provision of food, and considering that China is really well organized in terms of, for instance, digital online selling, that actually was quite an important aspect for the sustainability of the provision of food and so on. The whole report that I did that I coordinated, the report you mentioned for UNESCO, was about the digital countryside, and how much actually this is reshaping entirely the economy. Then, of course, another pillar of the economy in rural areas is also increasing with tourism. And of course, that was badly affected and hit by the virus. But I think that actually is recovering quite quickly in that sense.
Can you go into a little bit more detail about the online food provisioning? Because I mentioned in my introduction that there is some concern here that our supply chains for food are going to be interrupted potentially at some level. I think at this point it was in poultries and meats they were referring to, but what is it about the online provisioning of food that is of interest, do you think, or instructive?
I think some of the problems for the provision of food in areas where I mean, I'm not talking about China, I'm talking about in general, was not in areas where were not used to high demand of, let's say, digital purchasing. That was a problem in terms of delivering in a way. But in China, that this has been actually since long time quite well developed. I think, I mean, according to what I've heard and talking with colleagues and friends and so on, that this was not really a huge problem due to the fact that the organization was already in place. So actually, there was still the possibility of purchasing food even from the countryside. There is a lot of now of increasing linkages between the surrounding villages and the main town for food provision and so on. So it actually worked quite well.
That's interesting. Do you know if that was a government initiative or a commercial government sort of partnership that perhaps mandated it or set this up as part of a planning infrastructure?
the situation in China at the moment is that in some areas, of course, the government is still playing a major role in providing support. I mean, that was actually the main contents of the report that I did a few months ago, in terms of enhancing the skills and providing, of course, the platform. But on the other hand, the private sector is also reacting quite well, and therefore is you can see lots of new initiatives from the private sector to let's say to enter the business and to go back to the countryside even, and then to provide to set up businesses and then to provide food and other things, let's say, for cities. So it's both, actually.
Interesting. That's really interesting. Let's switch to the healthcare system. How is the overall healthcare system in the rural areas? There's obviously some concern here that if we did get hit, that hospitals, I'm talking about the United States now, that if we did get hit, the healthcare systems in the rural areas would be overwhelmed. I want to talk about Italy and its southern parts a little bit later, but is the healthcare system in rural China also as intimately connected, either online through telehealth or in fact to the more I would assume sophisticated urban healthcare systems?
Yes, of course, this is more problematic. Overall, the quality of the healthcare system there is a huge gap between the healthcare in urban and rural areas in China. And this is a long-lasting problem, of course. And now, the issue here is that when, the real problem would have been migrants, rural migrants living in cities and having access to the healthcare, which is, they still don't have the same access as urban citizens. However, when the outbreak started by the end of January, it was right before the Chinese New Year, which is normally when most of the migrants, they are coming back home in their villages, in their hometown, and so on, really depopulating cities. I think that was a fortune for China in that sense, because when the outbreak started, as I said before, in cities, in urban areas, actually, most of the migrants were already home. Because otherwise it would have been a problem, because they don't have the same rights in a certain way. Then, as cities have been hit, and therefore problems, we have seen problems of hospitals, and of course, particularly in Wuhan, when they had quickly, over the night, in 1 week, 10 days, rebuilt a new hospital. Of course, emergency was there, but was not really then in the rural areas, fortunately, because otherwise would have been a problem for both in the rural areas or in cities with a larger amount of population with not the same capability of accessing that.
So there is a large rural population that migrates
Yes, yeah,
to the cities, and alternatively, is there an urban population that goes out to the rural areas during harvest time and helps the production for food?
The main sort of migration is between, let's say, rural to urban. We are talking about 270 something, I don't know the latest numbers of million of people. So it's a huge amount of the population. And they are normally, during the festivity, they are sort of coming back home with huge pressure on the transportation system. And this, as you can imagine, while instead, let's say the urban to rural is mainly for tourism, for like weekend activities or few other sort of for other economic interests or businesses, but it's very limited in general.
Yeah. With regard to the provisioning of healthcare, my wife was over there about 1.5 years ago. She works in the fashion industry, and there are a lot of fashion production. The factories are over there, right? And she actually got hurt. She hurt her arm or shoulder, and she went to a hospital, and they took her to a decent hospital in the city where she was. But she said that even though it was very efficient, the way she was brought in and so forth, but she said when she went to see the doctor, he was waiting for her with a cigarette in his mouth. I said, well, they haven't gotten that message, at least about smoking. But she said overall the treatment was good, but this was a very, very good hospital. Have you noticed that the quality of healthcare has improved in the rural areas in China? And did you ever have to use the healthcare system?
No, not in the rural areas, but I mean, of course, I used that in hospitals in Suzhou where I lived, and clearly you might sort of be, you might remain, how to say, surprised by certain behaviors, but overall, I would not judge that based on anecdotes in a certain way, because overall, for a middle-income country overall, and then of course in some urban areas is now at the same level of advanced countries, China is doing, I mean, pretty well in terms of provision of healthcare, and particularly in terms of access to healthcare. I think that's the key. So in a certain way, no one is left behind, to use United Nations terminology, and that despite the fact that still the quality of the urban and rural there's a huge gap, as I said before, there is a possibility of covering large part of the population, if not all.
Are there any lessons, as you've observed the pandemic in Europe, of course, where you are in France, and probably what you've picked up from UK news? Of course, you teach, as I said, at Westminster, and in the United States, you are very familiar here. Are there any lessons that perhaps you observed in China that policymakers here might pay attention to as we continue to tackle this?
That's a difficult question. Most of the lessons that we can learn from China today are, let's say, coming mostly from a combination of a very sort of efficient centralized system paired with the mentality and behavior of people, which is rooted in the traditional Chinese culture, which is linked to Confucianism. I mean, just to mention the most important. And that means that is a combination of sort of possibility of leading things very strongly and having people somehow tolerating the possibility of giving away some part of their freedom in the name of the public good. I think that's the key for the success, for instance, of countries like China, but also Taiwan, on how they are tackling that. The problem in the West is that this is less, how to say, frequent, less present, and therefore probably it might require slightly longer to deal with the problems that we are encountering.
Well, and we're discovering that, I think, with the emphasis on the individual here, it culturally, it does make it more difficult. And I was struck by our governor, a gentleman named Andrew Cuomo in New York, who quoted Franklin Roosevelt during the World War II. And he said that courage is not the absence of fear, but it is an assessment that there is something greater than our fear, and that is our community, our society. And so we are beginning to address each other on that basis. And as I've mentioned on this show, as it happened in Europe, every night at 7 o'clock, we all go to our windows and we cheer for our healthcare workers. So almost organically, we're finding these things to rally around that make us one. But it does lead me to the final question, Giulio, which is the area where you have done some groundbreaking work in the area of how culture can be a sustainable factor. There's obviously going to be social decline as people experience this pandemic. You know, we're in our apartments. People were locked down in Wuhan and other parts of China. What were the tools that the rural cultures would use to manage the anxiety and the stress so that they wouldn't experience these traumas? Is there something is there a technology solution to that? Is there a cultural response that you would suspect is going to occur?
Yeah, that's again difficult to say, but I think there should be a combination of various tools. Clearly, there is still the need to nurture culture, but also I would say even, I mean, just to talk about something very concrete, education. And so for instance, I mean, I am working in a university, in a privileged university of Europe, or same as North America, but most of schools and universities are closed and shut down. So that would last for a while, and that creates problems in terms of, again, as I said before, possibility of sort of engaging with kids and so on. And then on the other hand, you have, so these, for instance, digital tools, online education, these are all important tools, but on the other hand, it's difficult to somehow to reach out and to really implement that effectively in certain areas, in China, but everywhere. And then, of course, you have the cultural tools. And I think this we will see in the future, what will happen, if this will strengthen some of our sort of, make us all more resilient and being capable to tap into our, again, instruments which are coming from different cultures. And I think there's no one solution. So you can tap on the Chinese Confucianism, as I said before, or on the Western more sense of, although being very independent and free, and sense of community, which is rising right now. Both are legitimate, I would say, and important.
Yeah, and as you say, the Confucianism is going to be an important tool, and there's a reason that these wisdom traditions are around for 3,000, 4,000 years, aren't they?
Probably, yes.
Yeah. I want to switch and go to Europe, to a country that you and I both have an affiliation with, and that would be Italy. Of course, you got your PhD at the University of Ferrara. You're an Italian citizen. My ancestors came from southern Italy, from the Calabrian region. I was writing yesterday about my grandfather, who actually came over here and died in the last pandemic in 1919. He was not the grandfather that I knew, but he came from that region as well. We spoke the other day, and you said something that really struck home at my heart, which was that Calabria and southern Italy, which tends to be a more rural population, has not experienced the wave that was experienced in Bergamo and parts of the north. And you said, thank goodness, because they would be ill-equipped to handle a wave of this pandemic there, simply because I think you said to me that the only way you get to an ICU in some of those villages is by helicopter. And I suspect that's not a very sustainable healthcare option. Can you just answer for me, why do you think it hasn't reached southern Italy, and what would happen if it did?
Yeah, of course, the situation, the healthcare situation, is very different from the north, in the south of Italy, and we could say that, yeah, thanks God, it didn't reach the south. On the other hand, I would like to see this in a sort of more positive way, and trying to look at what are the positive aspects, because one of the reasons why it didn't really happen, well, it's partially because, again, I mean, most of the people, they still live in the north, of course, and cities and Lombardy is a hub, so it's more exposed to fluxes of people and coming, and of course bringing more risks, if you like. But on the other hand, I was recently looking at the numbers, both in Italy and also in the UK, but I suppose this is a very general trend. Most of people really that were hit were people living in home care, elderly particularly, which is much more spread in the north than in the south. So people in the south, they are still, particularly the elderly, they are still living in their own house. In that sense, or with families, if you like, but in any case, there is less reliance on sort of this system. And that helped actually to contain the spreading, but more than, to contain the spreading, to reduce the number of casualties. And therefore, this is an aspect of, again, that shows that rural areas, or less developed in the way we conceive development areas, might show some aspect of resilience as well, which we should take into consideration, because are important for rethinking the future of our cities and how we deal with, for instance, the elderly and the vulnerable and the marginal in general terms.
You know, part of your discipline is urban planning and design, of course. Is there now going to be, do you think, an undertaking to look at some of those aspects when we begin to plan our cities and our communities going forward?
Absolutely. We can't really, I mean, every time in the history there was an outbreak or a big health problem, there were responses at the city level, and planning has been really instrumental to do that. Now, I think that we should be, I mean, I heard many things actually so far. We should be careful to, for instance, to just accuse the fact of living in dense areas as a problem of for global health in general. The problem is not density in itself, because actually being compact is an important aspect in terms of sustainability, environmental sustainability. The problem is being in dense areas with overcrowding problems and with lack of good housing condition, or, as I said before, over relying on systems such as home care and so on. So these are the real risks, and we are seeing that the vulnerable, for instance, in cities like in London, are those they're having those problems more than the rest. So I think that this should be taken into consideration for rethinking the future, the cities, the city of the future. And in this system, the countryside will probably play an important role as an area which could offer an healthy environment for living and working, particularly considering that there will be also an increasing probably shift towards online working, that it has proved to be successful in a certain way, although just related to certain kind of profession and certain kind of job. And I think we need to be clear about that. It's not everyone that can afford to work at home. Just some probably more privileged groups and professionals, but not those essential workers which are still in need to go to work every day.
Well, that's right. And we see them on the front lines here, but to your point, it's an interesting proposition that people may be able to work in less dense places and have a more vibrant family structure where people do hold themselves together and stay close to their elders and their families, as opposed to what we've experienced the last 60 years, which is this sort of diaspora away from the villages in which you were born into the cities, leaving the elderly behind, right? Is that kind of the model you're trying to repair?
Yeah. I think it should be both. It should be really both. Working on making cities more, how to say, fair and just, and reducing inequality within cities, and considering the countryside as a suitable alternative for a good life.
I think it's a great way to end the conversation on a very, very positive note. Giulio Verdini, thank you so much for coming back and talking with me. I always enjoy talking to you. And will you be going out today, or are you staying inside?
I'm stuck at home, and I suggest to stay at home.
That's right. That's a very good message. Well, again, thank you very much. We'll talk to you again.
Thank you.
The No Place But Home series is produced by ICF as a service to its network of intelligent communities around the world. Shout out to our series producer, Matt Owen. In future episodes, we will speak with more from our top 7 intelligent communities, as well as people from Vietnam and people from Biopharma, the company in the United States that is going to be providing the majority of the testing equipment here. To view prior conversations, go to intelligentcommunity.org/COVID-19, and you can follow us on Twitter at New Communities, and we encourage you to do that. I'm Lou Zacharilla. I want you to stay connected to your community, and I want you to stay safe. So thank you again for watching us, and we'll see you next time from New York.